Hi everybody, and welcome to this webinar on trauma prevention and early intervention approaches with children. We're so glad to have you all joining us today. And my name's Dan Moss, and I'm the Manager of Practice Development here at Emerging Minds. And we're really excited to be able to introduce our facilitators today and our guests. Before we do that, we'd just like to recognise and pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around the country and the different lands that we work, play and meet on throughout this country. We recognise the contribution that Aboriginal communities and leaders make to the way that we think about approaches to children and their families, which underline safety and security and connection. We acknowledge and respect the traditional connections to land, waters, culture, spirituality, family and communities. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you everybody for the amazing response to this webinar and to the very insightful questions that we've got. We're going to try to get through a few of them today. So before we begin our discussion, I have a little bit of housekeeping. So the session is being live captioned, so if you require captions, please follow the link in the chat. There's a live Q&A at the end, so questions via the questions tab in the go-to webinar control panel. We'll aim to get as many of these answers as we can, but bear with us because we have had quite a lot of interest in this webinar. There's some related readings and resources referred to during this webinar that are available in handouts tab of go-to webinar control panel. So those of you who throughout this webinar want to know a little bit more about the Australian Child Maltreatment Study and other related resources, you can use that handouts tab. There will be a short feedback survey which will open at the end of this webinar. Please feel free to have a read of that. And just importantly and lastly, during this webinar, we will be discussing topics such as child abuse, neglect, maltreatment. So please take care of yourself while you are listening to this. And if you think you'd benefit from some support, there are some resources also available in the chat for you, but also take a moment if you need to, or chat to a friend, a colleague or a supervisor. And we also just whenever we're talking about this, we want to invite each other to recognise that children, young people and adults within families and communities who have many and varied lived experiences of pain, trauma and heartache, including harmful systemic practices, and we want to recognise and give compassion to them, and also thank them for their contribution to everything that we know about early intervention and prevention strategies for children, young people and adults. So today, this webinar is going to hopefully do a lot of things, but really we want to help increase awareness of the findings from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study to support practice skills in making children's and young people's safety a fundamental aspect to practices. And we want to explore practice skills for supporting children, young people and parents to describe experiences of abuse and neglect, and to be supported to recover early and preventatively. So full bios for both Daryl and Shankari can be found on our handout tabs, but it's my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome Professor Daryl Higgins and Shankari Sundaram to our webinar today. Welcome both of you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
So Daryl, if I start with you, you're known as one of the chief investigators of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. And one of the great and significant contributions of that study was to show us the extent of the problem of child abuse and neglect in our society. If we already didn't know that problem, really exemplified some of those issues that we are facing. Why is it important for us to know just how serious this issue is?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And it's lovely to be joining you from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne, where I'm coming from today. And I acknowledge the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Um, as you say, I think the ACMS has been a really landmark study documenting the extent of abuse and neglect. And the reason why it was so important was a number of factors, I suppose. Firstly, when it comes to addressing a problem like child abuse and neglect, unless we know the size of the problem, we don't know how much effort is required to be able to deal with it, whether we're thinking either about prevention or whether we're thinking about healing and recovery, dealing with the mental health and the health risk behaviours that are associated with it. Secondly, we often tend to, up until now, have reverted to our statutory child protection system data to understand the context of, how many people have experienced child abuse and neglect. And I think the ACMS data, when you compare it to, the data that's reported each year by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which is a combination of the state and territory child protection system data, really lets us know that our statutory systems are only serving the pointy end of a much, much bigger problem. But thirdly, I think from a kind of mental health and wellbeing perspective, what we realise is that many workforces, in the health sector, the mental health sector, the drug and alcohol sector, are really trauma recovery sectors. Those are the places where the consequences of child abuse and neglect are really seen. And similarly, we know that many professionals who are working and coming in contact with children are prevention potential workforces. And so for, school teachers, early childhood, early childhood is on everyone's mind at the moment, they all need to be able to recognise the very high chance that children in their care, that families that they're coming in contact with, either have experienced abuse or are likely to over the rest of their childhood. And I think, having the prevalence data that the ACMS study has provided really means that we can't turn away from that reality of it being a frequently occurring phenomenon, and therefore we actually have to garner together these workforces that are both the kind of trauma prevention and the trauma recovery workforces.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. What a wonderful phrase there, the prevention potential workforces. That's fantastic.
They may not know it yet, but I believe it. I have faith.
Wonderful. Thanks, Daryl. Shankari, welcome. As a practitioner, can you comment on the importance of early and effective interventions with children and young people?
Thank you, Dan, for having me on this webinar. And I'm joining from Ghana country in the Adelaide Plains. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I just wanted to say as well that we think of trauma as the events that have occurred, but it's not the events that they have the potential to induce and sustain trauma, but it's more the nervous system's overwhelmed response to what has occurred that creates the traumatic impact. And the importance of early and effective interventions is that we know that there is this window of opportunity right in the aftermath of events occurring, where there is the potential to create those protective factors that can prevent a long-term lingering impact. And especially with children, we know that developing brains and nervous systems have that the impact can be long-term because it can shift how brains develop if abuse occurs. But the same thing is also that window of opportunity because of the developing mind having the capacity to build resilience. And so early interventions are therefore really vital. But also effective interventions are that we are able to tailor what we are doing to the context of the child and not having preconceived ideas about what that should be. being more flexible and tuned in to what's happening for the child in their context.
Yeah, thank you, Shankari. Yeah, some great insights there. Daryl, I'm going to ask you now, because we've had lots of our participants today who are joining us ask, really for some background in terms of what is the Australian Child Maltreatment Study and what did it find?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So it's the first nationally representative study of prevalence of all 5 forms of child abuse and neglect: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. So it's a random digit dial, so everyone had an equal opportunity to get a phone call from our interviewer team and asked a whole heap of questions around experiences during childhood, so prior to age 18. And so our sample was 8,500 Australians aged 16 and over who were talking retrospectively about their childhood experiences of maltreatment, but equally importantly, talking about their current mental health and health-related behaviours like smoking and drinking and suicidal thoughts or behaviours, etc. So it allowed us to calculate prevalence rates, so what proportion of the entire population has experienced each of these 5 forms of abuse and neglect. And as I said before, it's really quite challenging and shocking statistics that we found that 32% of the population have experienced physical abuse, 28.5% had experienced sexual abuse, 30.9% had experienced emotional abuse. Neglect was reported by 8.9%, and finally exposure to domestic violence was the largest group, so 39.6%. So that's nearly 2 in 5 Australians. But also because we'd measured all 5 forms at the same time, it allowed us to then calculate things like overlap. And what we found was that any form of abuse or neglect was experienced by 62% of the population. But of those who did experience abuse, almost 2/3 experienced not just one type, but 2 or more. And that was a really significant finding, both in terms of our understanding of the nature of maltreatment, that multi-type maltreatment is the most common or prevalent presentation, if you like, of those who've experienced maltreatment. But secondly, when we did our analyses of mental health and health risk behaviours, the odds or the likelihood of going on to experience in adulthood a mental health condition or a health risk behaviour was much, much, much more substantial if you'd experienced multiple types of abuse and neglect compared to those who had just experienced one type, and definitely more than those who'd experienced no abuse or neglect.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. So Shankari, just thinking about some of that and the obstacles, I suppose, that children and young people have to describing some of these experiences. What are the strategies that all practitioners can use to help children and young people describe their experiences of abuse?
We often find, and we get this feedback in our service because our service is the Child Sexual Abuse Counselling Service and also the Victims of Crime Service, where we get referrals for children. And we often get this feedback from clients where they say that the existing counsellor or practitioner that the child was working with was not comfortable with this topic, and therefore they needed a specialized service. And so I do strongly believe that all practitioners, as you said, developing comfort around creating safety for children to be able to talk about these experiences is important, not just in treatment, but also, as Daryl said, in creating those preventative spaces, because if we don't create safe spaces where children are able to talk about these experiences, then things go undisclosed and more abuse can occur. And so I do think that all practitioners developing comfort around that is important. And part of that is to recognize that the primary intervention is the relationship that you as a practitioner build with the child. And it could be in existing relationships, say a school counselor or a teacher, and offering that sense of space of safety and attunement. And of course, people who work with children use a lot of multimodal ways of expressing, whether it's through drawings or storytelling or metaphors, to externalize the problem, and it makes it less daunting for a child to talk about problems that are externalized. And also, like, allowing expression to go at its own pace and not imposing our need for information on children. And so all of these, I think, create the foundation for children to be able to express what's happening to them. And if parents are involved, of course, part of it is also working with the parents to do the same. One more thing that's just coming to mind is that often when there is a disclosure made or an initial whatever the child is wanting to share, our emotional response can also make it unsafe for the child to share more. So finding ways to ground our own emotions is really important for all practitioners.
Daryl, if we can rejoin with you, much of your work involves advocating for prevention strategies regarding child abuse or neglect. How can practitioners and organisations contribute to these strategies?
Yeah, Dan, look, it's a good question. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to riff off one of the comments that Shankari made, and I think it's really important about the kind of idea of adults and the kind of self-regulation or how it is that you respond to children's questions. I was really thinking about one of the key pieces of data from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study is that 62% of us adults have our own childhood abuse or neglect experiences. And so often it is that difficulty that we have as adults acknowledging our own experiences that might get in the way of being present and hearing children and young people's experiences. So I really resonated, Shankari, with what you were saying, and I think it's a really important part. So Dan, in terms of yes, you're right. I do have a very strong kind of advocacy role in terms of prevention. How can people contribute to that? Well, I think it's in a range of ways. Some people are already very directly involved with that, and I would say that there's probably 2 or 3 different elements to this. So some of them are very specific. So child sexual abuse, I think, has some of its own kind of prevention strategies that are unique. So there's a lot of people who are talking about body safety, who are talking about consent and respect education, who are talking about what we would call child abuse prevention, child sexual abuse prevention education, whether it's in schools, whether it's working with adults to increase their knowledge and, as we've just been saying, their kind of comfort and ability to hear concerns from children and young people. Certainly my team at the Institute of Child Protection Studies have recognised that one of the difficulties is that we often don't want to hear concerns from children. Teachers will often be dismissive when someone raises a concern, and that concern might actually be highlighting grooming behaviour. And yet if we listened and paid attention, we might be able to avert that grooming behaviour from turning into an actual instance of child sexual abuse. But in terms of other forms of abuse and neglect, really we know that the kind of clean water of child abuse and neglect prevention is parenting, good quality parenting. And so the prevention strategy is really delivering of evidence-based parenting programs and supports. And I like to say programs and supports because it's not always a case of funneling high-risk parents into a structured program. That's often kind of been our go-to strategy in Australia, is we have a discrete program, that often high-risk families who are typically referred from statutory child protection systems get pushed into those programs. So that's what I would call kind of not even early intervention, that's probably late intervention. Earlier intervention and genuine prevention, stopping abuse or neglect from occurring in the first place means giving support for all parents, for all families, right throughout their lifespan. So starting from pre-birth, I would say, through those kind of really early years in the maternal and child health sector, through the early childhood services, when they might be connecting with a childcare centre or a kindergarten, and then through schooling, and of course right throughout the continued engagement with health services like GPs, that we need to be able to have appropriate interventions where those who are already coming in contact with a family can be supporting and encouraging around using, non-violent, non-coercive, evidence-based approaches to parenting. So in that sense, there's a big range of practitioners who can be involved, but I think some of the kind of traditional child abuse and neglect prevention workforce, which is the child and family welfare services sector, are often not located or basing their services in the places where families already are. But of course, we're seeing some signs of change. We're seeing some really good examples of things like community hubs or schools as hubs, where those services are actually coming into those places where families already are, and are operating their services in ways that are a lot less stigmatizing. So I don't have to kind of put up my hand and say, I've got a problem with parenting in order to be able to get the kind of parenting support that I need. And it can be at a range of levels of intensity. We know that school principals and school wellbeing officers can have, whether it's a regular weekly newsletter, whether it's in an assembly where parents are coming in, those promotion of the kind of supports that parents might need, and normalizing, having everybody coming along to what we might think of as a traditional parenting class, so it's not just for the kind of troubled few, but rather recognizing that we can all benefit from a level of support.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Daryl. And so Shankari, in terms of overcoming obstacles for children and young people, in terms of talking about some of their experiences of maltreatment or abuse, how do you help them? How do you help children and young people to use their own language, actually, to describe their experiences to you in practice?
And I find that it's more us not interfering with the process, and adults can sometimes tend to impose their own language on children's experiences. And after establishing that safety, the foundation of safety, just not interfering in the process, and if children are using symbolic language or are being vague, also not being quick to make meaning, our own meaning of it, and from a place of curiosity as well, just asking into what that means for them. And we know that experiences are not just what happens, but how we make meaning of what happens, right? So, and how children make meaning can be very different to how we make meaning. So yeah, honoring the ownership of the story that children have by honoring the language that they use, and us mirroring that back to them. Like if we are using, if they say that scary thing, or just using the same terminology can be helpful, rather than using our own. And also remembering that our role is, at least my role, is therapeutic, and I'm not an investigator. It's not about the facts of what happened. Depending on whether I need to make a report, then I may need information. But even then, not interrogating the child, and being child-led and with pace and readiness. Also watching for non-verbal signs, and if there is disclosures being made, and gently asking into it. But if there are non-verbal signs of the child feeling unsafe, also learning how to step back and go back to rebuilding safety first, and then venturing back into asking into the experience more.
Thanks, Shankari. Some great advice there. Daryl, why is it important for us to be helping parents, children and young people to develop common language around consent and respect, particularly as it relates to child sexual abuse?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. So, as I said before, I think that while there are some common strategies that go right across all forms of child abuse and neglect, and parenting and parent capability is a really critical part of that, there are some additional specific things that are just about child sexual abuse. And one important point that I didn't say before that we have learnt really strongly from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study is that the harm of sexual abuse is not coming just from adults, but it's also coming from other children and young people. And in fact, that's been increasing across time. So approximately 1 in 2 of those 28.5% of Australians who've experienced child sexual abuse experienced it from another child or adolescent, the biggest group being those who they knew. So someone else who was a peer, if you like. And also included within that is those who they were in a romantic relationship with at the time. That's particularly so for our young Australian girls, that they had about 5 times the rate. So the idea of addressing not just child sexual abuse at the hands of adults, but from other children and young people is a really critical part. And therefore, we have to be able to have conversations about addressing the knowledge and the capability of young people to not engage in harmful behaviour towards others. So that's where the kind of respect and consent comes in. But equally, to know that it's not okay to experience this and you can speak up and get help, so at the earlier signs to have the comfort. And both of those things, though, are predicated upon having good knowledge of sex and sexuality and body autonomy and body safety concepts. And so starting right from, the early years, we need to build up children's knowledge of, and their right to body integrity and have a kind of a child rights focus so that it's not just about, adolescence and being worried about, having sexual images shared online or difficulties in dating relationships, but right throughout childhood and adolescence, we're preparing young people and giving them the language and giving them the confidence that if there is a concern that they can talk about it, but also ensuring that particularly our young boys are being prepared for and trained to be respectful of boundaries and to not misuse or abuse their power over other children and young people. So kind of parents having the same kind of language skills and contexts as the children and young people that they are wanting to support and care for is really, really important.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. Shankari, how can practitioners make decisions about what and when they ask children and young people so that they can be supported to tell their stories, but so that they don't find the questions distressing?
Again, going back to the previous things that I've said about like laying the foundation of relational safety and grounding first, and not being in a hurry, of course. And I always find it interesting that it's not the what, but more the how that becomes important as well. And so the what is the intellectual, the logical, right? And if we think about the how, then we are tuning into the felt sense of the experience of the child and the distress that may come from it. And it's the emotional charge that is attached to the memory that we are trying to access. And so some other things that I often think about is not needing constant eye contact, for example. It seems like a simple thing, but when we are engaged in play or something else as we are talking, it doesn't feel as unsafe as someone staring at you and asking questions. It is the same for adults, but adults have trained themselves to be more comfortable with eye contact, at least in the Western cultural context. With children that have experienced abuse, also finding ways to cue in safety ongoingly as we are talking about things that may be distressing. And of course, grounding our own emotions and being that attuned presence as well. And also, I think we must keep going back to the question as to why am I asking this question? Is this for the benefit of the child, therapeutically or otherwise, or for safety? Or is it to satisfy my own curiosity that I need to know this? So I think being very intentional in what we are asking. From a therapeutic viewpoint, I like to keep the ideas of dual awareness and bilateral stimulation, which is from EMDR, also in mind. So they can be really helpful in grounding while talking about distressing things. I'll just explain dual awareness a little bit, if that's all right. And so dual awareness is the ability to be grounded in the present moment while the mind is being exposed to something distressing. So whether it's talking about an event that is potentially traumatic or any other distressing event that the child is or young person is trying to verbalize. So finding ways to have something that is happening in the present moment, whether it is a somatic grounding or a bilateral thing. So it can be, I can be talking to a child while maybe having a ball that the child can toss from one hand to the other. So that's bilateral stimulation while talking about something distressing. So it's the intention of that process is not just to get information, but it's also to use that as a therapeutic process. So the talking about it is re-experiencing while also establishing safety like together, both happening together. That's what's been shown to be therapeutic. So we can be so creative in how we incorporate this with children. It can be relational. So if you're playing a game, something back and forth between the practitioner and the child while we're talking. It can be co-regulation that we're practicing, but any form of bilateral movement. And I sent through some tools that I often use with children, young people, as well as adults. So I use alternate nostril breathing from yoga. That's bilateral. So we could do that kind of a practice to ground, and then something while we're talking about distressing things with children. And it's quite fascinating how it shifts the comfort levels and how it becomes easier for young people to talk about their experiences.
Thank you, Shankari. Yeah, wonderful. Daryl, you talk about developing in our children and young people this language of respect and consent. Are you seeing changes in the ways that parents have conversations with their children about consent and respect? And what more do you think needs to happen?
Yeah. Look, I think changes are occurring. I'm often hearing it via professionals that I'm talking to, whether it be, teachers in schools, whether it be, people in health services or particularly in the child and family welfare sector. But I'm also aware of kind of changes that are happening through the kind of policy shifts and the interventions that governments put in place. So, for example, the National Office of Child Safety has their One Talk at a Time campaign, and that's it's a very clear and simple campaign of kind of child safe conversations are the responsibility of parents. Like, it's the parent and carer that has to initiate. And it's simply one talk at a time, as the name implies. And so every little opportune moment, whether you're waiting for a bus, whether you're talking over a book, whether you're discussing a film that you've seen, whether you're driving in the car on the way to an appointment, they're all fantastic opportunities to just lean in and be attuned to the emotional needs of your child, but also to introduce these topics that can be a little bit scary and a little bit daunting if we haven't done the homework ourselves, if we haven't kind of started early on, started with very innocuous kind of conversations around, what makes us feel comfortable, what makes us feel uncomfortable. And once we're in a more routine space of doing that, about, everyday activities, then if something more significant is happening that a child might need to let us as the parent or the adult in the relationship know, that they can feel confident that we're going to be listening, We've already given them the language because we've been discussing the topics. You know, if we've seen something in a movie, being able to put language around that, you know, to be able to say, I'm wondering whether they really agreed to that action that other, protagonist was engaging in with them. Did you see, you know, that's what we call consent, you know. So being able to have those kind of conversations about stuff that's going on, and there's plenty of examples in the kind of popular zeitgeist that we can draw on as parents and carers. And I'm also kind of interested in how this relates to, you know, another of the areas of concern, which is about online behaviours. I suppose where I'm seeing less engagement around, you know, kind of changes in parenting is that I don't know that we're always calling out how and why it is that parents are rightly concerned about online behaviour. So whether it's about online gaming, whether it's about sharing sexual images, whether it's about, you know, grooming that might be happening online, we're often not saying why it is that we think that this is a space that has risk. Perhaps because we've not really thought it through ourselves. We just see it as a kind of dark and dangerous space that we don't understand, rather than actually understanding the mechanisms by which someone who is wanting to perpetrate, you know, whether that's an adult or whether it's another child or young person who may even be using it opportunistically, is able to engage in inappropriate behavior, you know, or the lead up to that, you know, the kind of grooming behavior. So being able to kind of be more explicit. So, for example, if it's gaming, you know, to understand that the person that you're engaging with on this online game, they say that they're you've got a 13-year-old boy. They say they're a 13-year-old girl. Is it in fact a girl who's 13? What if it was a 54-year-old man who's pretending to be a 13-year-old girl? So being able to explain that issue of somebody's ability to understand what the nature of the risks are, and how opportunities to engage in inappropriate behaviour when there's nobody else observing. And so, you know, parents then, I think, are not always attuned into, okay, well, there's a lot less risk playing an online game with that 13-year-old girl when I'm playing with my 13-year-old son, and we're together, you know, and we're playing the game together, and we're talking about those interactions and asking questions. And so I suppose I'm perhaps hearing less about that, about how it is that we enter into children's worlds, how we walk alongside them, understand the risks that they might be facing, and kind of talk them through and work through that. Just in the same way that we do with any other parenting issue. We don't always know exactly where they are and what they're doing, but we can, you know, draw on our own personal experiences to the degree that we're able to, but we can ask questions, be curious, and have this as a shared journey. So yeah, so kind of the short answer is I'm seeing some changes, but I'm seeing some opportunities that we're not yet capitalizing on to the degree that I think that we need to. But one final comment I'd make is I think that there's some really great communication and engagement strategies. So people will have perhaps come across the Teeny Tiny Stevies, who, you know, have got a little song that's, you know, aimed at quite young children around body safety. And it's those kind of things that I think start off the conversations really early on. And we have to kind of build that momentum from those early childhood years right through, so that we don't kind of have this great chasm between many parents and adolescent children, where it's, you know, you feel like you're in opposite ends of the galaxy.
Yeah. Thanks, Daryl. Shankari, in thinking of this task that we have, which Daryl's describing in terms of supporting parents to support their child or young person, in your work, particularly with non-offending parents, how do you support them to help children recover from the effects, specifically of child sexual abuse?
And it can always be, it is such a disruptor when something like this happens. And we are often seeing the non-offending parent and the child right in the aftermath, and it could have been like a shock or a surprise for the whole family, and the family is fractured. And parents, or the non-offending parent, would be struggling with their own shock and trauma from what has occurred. So what I said earlier about the adults finding ways to ground themselves, especially when they're trying to help their children. So part of our work is helping parents do that and encouraging them to seek their own supports separate to the supports they're seeking with the child, and being able to find ways to contain, whether it's the language that they're using in front of children or young people, any pathologizing words that they are using to describe what's occurred. And there could be guilt and other things that are coming into play as well for parents. I like to think of events that surround what we identify as the major potentially trauma-inducing event as other trauma points that we can be, if we are able to manage those well, we can prevent extra trauma points from occurring. So like when I work with adult survivors of child sexual abuse, and we talk about trauma memories, and if we are working therapeutically through memories, some of those memories are not directly related to the main event, but it could be, or the look on my mother's face and these words that she used when she found out, for example. And so if we're able to manage our responses in those moments, we can reduce those extra trauma points that we may create, which could be preventable. So in working with parents, I often like to look at that. And of course, if the child will still have emotions and love for the parent, the offending parent. So it can be really hard for the non-offending parent to manage and create space for that, the grief and loss that may occur if the family is suddenly fractured. Of course, every context is different, but I have seen contexts where the family, it was a tight, loving unit, and then this came out, and the child is really grieving the loss of the parent that was the offender. So helping parents create space for that grief and loss process for children as well. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, also reminding parents that when we're trying to prevent the impact of trauma, what we're trying to do is we're countering that effect by cueing in safety and attachment. So again, focusing on securing that attachment again as the foundation for trauma prevention.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, we've got some amazing questions coming through from the chat. So thank you for all of that from our many participants today, and thanks for bearing with us through the technical issues. So Daryl, quite a few questions here about this idea that trends are actually changing in child abuse and neglect over the past years. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in relation to those changing trends?
Yeah, so I think the Australian Child Maltreatment Study shows that we do have a few changes. Largely, we still have a very big problem. But one sign of hope that we certainly saw in our data was a reduction across time in the likelihood of experiencing sexual abuse from a parent or a caregiver in the home. So the rate for that form of child sexual abuse has approximately halved from people in their kind of, middle ages and onwards. The rate was up around 8 or 9%. But for our youth sample, so that was the 3,500 young people aged 16 to 24, the rate of child sexual abuse experienced by a parent or a caregiver was much lower, so at around about 4%. So that's good news. Unfortunately, even that good news is offset to a substantial degree by what I was talking about before, that increase in risk of sexual abuse from another child or young person. So that has kind of been growing over time. So our 16 to 24-year-olds were much more likely to be reporting sexual abuse, either by from another child or adolescent who they knew but wasn't in a romantic relationship, or someone who was. But of course, both of those are very gendered ones. So the trend is really towards increased risk for young girls, so for women, during childhood or adolescence to experience sexual harm from someone in a dating relationship. That's probably one of the biggest trends. The other one that is slightly outside of this discussion of child abuse and neglect, but we still measured it in the ACMS, and that was exposure to corporal punishment. And what we saw was a really pleasing decrease in the beliefs around the necessity of using physical punishment by parents. So we have got some signs of hope in terms of changing relationships, and we know that physical punishment is strongly related to the risk of physical abuse. And so one of the best ways of avoiding any form of physical abuse is to protect children from every form of violence, including physical punishment for the purposes of, a kind of correction, or as a parenting practice. And I use parenting in inverted commas because I believe that children should be safe and free from violence in every context, including within their homes. So we certainly are seeing some signs of hope. The most challenging thing for me, though, was that the proportion of Australians who have experienced multiple forms of abuse or neglect hasn't decreased across time. In fact, there's even a slight trend towards it going up in the youth sample compared to the rest of the sample overall. So we've got greater complexity, if you like, those risks across the 5 different types coming together.
Thanks, Daryl. Shankar, for you, and Daryl's kind of talking there about an increase in young people experiencing harmful sexual behaviour in relationships or through peers. Are you seeing an increase in young people after harmful sexual behaviour in your practice?
We are, and so this service has been around for about 3.5 years. So 3.5 years, we have seen a steady increase. And the service is for anyone who's experienced child sexual abuse, and including adults. So about 20% of our clients right now would be children. But over the years, there has been a steady increase. I think it's due to greater awareness and more willingness for people to refer children to the service for support. We're seeing an increase in school referrals as well. And this includes, we're seeing more sibling abuse, peer abuse, more than just a parent, or other adults.
Yeah. Daryl, some questions here about what your research might tell us about the kind of professional supports that are needed actually to help children's mental health after their experiences of maltreatment.
Yeah, so our research in the ACMS was about adults from age 16 onwards, but certainly what it showed us was that the young adults, so those 16 to 24s, had really experienced that, if you like, crystallization of those child maltreatment impacts very early in life. So it's not just in older age that they are apparent. They were apparent very early on. And the kind of things that we saw was that adults who've experienced child maltreatment are 3 times more likely to have a depressive disorder, 3 times more likely to have an anxiety disorder, 2.6 times more likely to have a severe alcohol use disorder, and 4.6 times more likely to have PTSD. And similar stories with health risk behaviours like suicide harm, suicide attempts, dependence on cocaine, was a really big one. So we recognise that there's a range of different both mental health and health risk behaviours that are strongly associated, and we're seeing them early on in life. So I think that gives us some clear direction of when we know that a child has experienced maltreatment, what can we do to either prevent these mental health disorders from emerging, or to recognise them early on and to treat them as soon as we can so that they don't become a lifetime disorder. We know that there are great psychological interventions available that can be trauma-informed and that can be delivered for children and adolescents, not just waiting until adulthood for the onset of symptoms or diagnosis.
From a practice perspective, Shankari, what are you finding most important in working with children and young people who have experienced abuse or maltreatment and maybe experience some of those signs of distress?
What Daryl said resonated a lot, and I think what's most important is the prevention of those long-term effects that Daryl spoke about. So I think as and when, whether it's young children or young adults, whenever it is presenting as distress, finding ways to reestablish that sense of safety. I think the base of whether it's secure attachment or finding ways to guide the nervous system back to safety and practicing that, whether it is in our sessions or helping parents practice that with their children, is in a sense, it's trying to counter that potential for long-term impacts. Somatic practices as well, like trying to, and what I find is it's harder to help adults shift away from being in their minds back into their bodies, but it can be more intuitive for especially young children, and using that again, that strength that young children have, and even young people and young adults may have a little bit more of that than adults who have had a lot of rationalization around their experiences rather than just the felt experiential sense of what's happened. So again, using that as an opportunity to go back to regulation. And what Daryl said before as well about having, when you have lots of things happen, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I think reestablishing safety is one of the greatest protective factors. I have lived experience of child sexual abuse, and I find that, like, through my experience as well as speaking to adult survivors, we know that it doesn't always have to be a certain way. If there are other things that are around the child or young person, trauma, it is possible to prevent the long-term impacts of trauma.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, Shankari. And thank you, everybody, for your time today. Again, for all of the interest in what is a really crucial research and practice and policy issue for all of us. It affects all of us. And, you know, the research that Daryl's spoken about today testifies to the fact that this is such a widespread issue throughout Australia, affecting so many of our children. So thank you to all of you, for joining us today. Thanks again to Shankari and Daryl for your practice and policy and research wisdom. That's been awesome. Thanks to the audience for hanging in there with some slight technical hiccups at the start. We'll have a recording of this webinar later for you, which will which will have those kind of glitches ironed out, and so you'll be able to see all of those parts of the webinar. Thanks to the wonderful team at AIFS, Child and Family Evidence and Evaluation Team, to Erin Stutchbury and Crystal Ella for their ongoing support and guidance and patience. So thank you, Erin and Crystal. Just a reminder, just make sure that you subscribe to AIFS or Emerging Minds newsletters, and you'll be notified about this recording, and you'll also have the opportunity to be seeing so many other webinars that are produced both by AIFS and Emerging Minds. Just a quick reminder also about our feedback survey. We'd really love to hear what you thought about today's webinar and other webinars actually, and help us to continue to provide the service to you which most fits with your needs. So as many of you know, next week is Child Protection Week, and AIFS is holding a webinar in collaboration with NAPCAN on preventing emotional abuse. So if you are interested in that, please register via the AIFS webinar. Emerging Minds and AIFS will be back with another webinar in October where we will actually be continuing this discussion on child abuse and neglect. We've got some great panellists lined up for that, and we hope you can join us for that in October. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. Thanks for your great questions. Thanks for your interests, and we'll see you again soon. Hi everybody, I'm Dan Moss again for the Q&A part of prevention and early intervention strategies with children after maltreatment and abuse. Great to have Daryl Higgins and Shankari Sundaram back with me to answer some more of your questions. Just before we begin, we'd just like to recognise that we have had lots of questions from you, which are great questions around working with young children and infants and toddlers. We might just direct you to how to recognise complex trauma in infants and children and promote wellbeing. That webinar is available both on the AIFS and the Emerging Minds website. So look forward to continuing the conversation with you around that. But we've had some really fantastic questions from others of you, and some in regard to, Daryl, what your research is telling us about suicidal ideation in children and young people after maltreatment.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So as I said, our study took data from people aged 16 and over, and in that, the youth sample, the 16 to 24-year-olds, we actually saw very high levels of suicidal and self-harming behaviour. So in that 16 to 24-year age group, those who'd experienced child maltreatment were 3.5 times more likely to have self-harm in the prior year, were 4.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide in the past year, and also 6.5 times more likely to be dependent on cannabis, which is often a coping mechanism for these kinds of trauma. And so, right across the youth sample, both those with and without child maltreatment, we saw self-harm as a problem anyway. So almost 3 in 10 Australians aged 16 to 24 had self-harmed at some stage in their life. Of course, much more common for young Australian women compared to young men. But as I said, the much greater likelihood of those who've experienced maltreatment, 3 or 4 times more likely. So it's a really strong kind of relationship that we see between these experiences of abuse and neglect and the much greater likelihood in those early adult years of experiencing suicidal thoughts or engaging in self-harming behaviour or suicide attempts.
Thanks, Daryl. And Shankari, are you seeing more of this in your practice? And what strategies do you use to work with young people who are experiencing suicidal ideation?
I'm certainly seeing more than the previous years, and as Daryl said, it's self-harming behaviors, also in young children, that and of course young people, and so part of it, of the idea of not wanting to be here anymore. I think I approach with curiosity, again, being grounded and not having an emotional response when disclosures are being made, especially if it is a young teen. They have a lot of fear around, lots of big tools being brought out or big risk assessments being done to the child and young person, rather than sitting with the discomfort. So I do try to rein all those feelings in and still attempt to do risk assessment processes, however, being grounded and calm and being accepting of what's being disclosed in the session. And also being curious, again, sitting in that curiosity as to how it's feeling and acknowledging that that is hard. And reaffirming that I'm here with you. Let's sit in that discomfort together. I think that's really important, and that I've seen that having that kind of a response ensures engagement, because the fear also is that the child or young person will refuse to see you if there's a strong response. With self-harm, I also look at self-harm as the distress needing to be regulated somatically, right? So self-harm is an intentional connection, quite a strong connection to the body again, through pain, perhaps, but it is still wanting to reconnect to the body. So I find practices like I use the EFT tapping, so emotional freedom technique. It used to be considered out there or not scientific, but we now know that there are many, many studies that have been done to show the efficacy. There is a leading researcher in Australia, Dr. Peter Stapleton from Bond University in Queensland, who is one of the leading researchers in EFT as a technique. So I have used EFT for self-harm in young people to shift away from. So if you're not familiar, it is tapping, and this is in the list of resources that I'd sent as well, tapping on different parts of the body, which it incorporates elements of bilateral stimulation while exposing ourselves to the distressing thoughts and emotions we're having, and tuning into the somatic experience of that as well. So something like that can be a great tool to use when the urge to self-harm comes up, and I found that to be quite effective in working with young people.
Right, thanks, Shankari. Daryl, lots of questions around what your study covers and about particular cohorts of children and young people and adults, in fact. So I'm wondering whether you can tell us a little bit about what's next. You know, what more do we know or need to know around children's and young people's experiences of child abuse and neglect?
Yeah, well, look, as a team, there were 10 of us who were the chief investigators, led by distinguished Professor Ben Matthews from QUT. We're all acutely aware of the limitations of our study. While, of course, we're incredibly proud that we think it's very rigorous, it gives us reliable data on past experiences of abuse and neglect. We know that there are a number of limitations. But thankfully, government has already committed to funding a follow-up type study. So a similar methodology with another sample of young people aged 16 to 24 in the future. So it could be used as a comparison with our study to see, are changes occurring? Is prevalence reducing on any of our forms of abuse and neglect? We, as the current ACMS team, have also provided some scoping for government around what we think some of the changes and adjustments that need to be made to that methodology, depending on who it is that conducts such future research. Clearly, one of the things that we recommended was that there needs to be a parallel study that's led by First Nations people. We had great representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in our study, but for cultural and ethical reasons, none of the chief investigators were First Nations, and so we have not disaggregated our data and presented separate prevalence statistics. So any future study like that would need to be led by Indigenous researchers and driven by questions from community that can be helpful to their healing journey and what they need to keep children safe and respond to the problem of child abuse and neglect in their communities. But we are also acutely aware that because of the funding and time constraints, that we were not able to ask any questions about protective factors. And we know that that's really important in understanding the impacts on people across time, but also whether kind of treatments are effective and whether prevention strategies can be built upon. And so any future studies need to do that. They also need to have better representation and engagement with questions around things like disability, and also culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So we know that there's a number of directions that we would like any future ACMS style study to address.
Great. Thank you, Daryl. Shankari, some questions here around some of the practice skills and strategies that you described. And one in particular around, can you please expand on this idea of making communication intentional with the children you work with?
I like to use the idea of slowing it down and zooming in. So being fully present, as present as we can with what we're doing. And that creates intentionality, which is intuitive. And so getting rid of the agenda that we may have in our heads about how the session should go, and being fully present. And this reminds me of what Daryl was saying earlier as well about those incidental interactions that we may have with our children as parents, right? Like, and we know that teenagers are more likely to talk to us about things that are important to them when we're driving. And so again, it becomes an incidental sharing and bonding rather than a planned and an agenda-based sharing. And so intentionality is also not having all those rigid intentions, so almost taking the rules away and the connection being the point of it, and everything else organically then flows from that. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Unintentional intentionality.
Yes. Yes, that's a good phrase. Thanks, Daryl.
Professor Daryl Higgins and Shankari Sundaram, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been an absolute privilege to bring you this webinar and this Q&A session. Thanks for all the great questions and your interest, and good luck in your future practice with children and young people who have been affected by abuse and neglect. Thank you.